Welcome to SoFlo by Lucas Miller. Lucas's latest collection of 13 short stories, ranging from the gross and silly to heart-wrenching thrillers of cosmic proportions. Join Lucas as he takes you beyond the beaches and shows you the dark side of the Sunshine State. Welcome to SoFlo, a collection of weird Florida horror by Lucas Miller. Available January 14th, 2024. Pre-order now. Brought to you by the Evil Cookie Publishing. Welcome to another episode of Dead Headspace. I'm your host, Patrick R. McDonough, joined always by my friend, Brennan LaFaro. Say hello, Brennan.
Hello, everybody.
And our other friend, Candice Nola. Say hello, Candice.
Hello.
It's like the fourth episode in a row that she's outshining us with her.
She's dressed to impress. There's no
I was
question
going
about
to
that.
say unbelievable aesthetics. And Josh Rountree, you are joining us today. Say hello, sir.
Hello, everybody.
And we'll dive into this soon, but he is the author of The Legend of Charlie Fish. Yeah, I don't want to talk any more about that just yet. We'll get back to that for sure and dive into that. But what got you into writing, man? Like the horror, Western, crime. I mean, maybe there's more, but reel it back to whatever point in time you want. Is there a person? Are there authors? Was it your parents or someone else that really got you into saying, hey, this is fun? Maybe not even that you want to do it for a living, just I like it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think like a whole lot of people who become writers, I've always been a reader. But yeah, I've been writing since I was a little kid. What I think what first got me into it is just kind of hanging out at my grandparents' bookshelves. I was born in the early 70s, so most of my, reading consciousness started in the late 70s, early 80s. And I just remember my grandmother having all these weird ghost books and mythology books and all kinds of spooky shit on her shelf. She was a ghost researcher at the time, and so there was always kind of Alfred Hitchcock collections and a bunch of that stuff. And my granddaddy was always handing me his Louis L'Amour westerns. I probably read 50 of those before I was in middle school. I mean, I just like chewed those things up like potato chips. I've always loved those. So I never really limited kind of what I was reading from genre to genre. I kind of just all brought it in together and kind of dumped it into my brain. I would read fantasy novels, Encyclopedia Brown, whatever you want to put in there. And then eventually, I'm sure I'm the first person ever to say this on the show, but I discovered Stephen King. That really kind of set me on a different direction. So, between watching that and watching all the horror movies at the time, it made everything I was starting to write, my little stories there, quite a bit darker. I got to where I would, I was writing stories all the time when I was a kid. By the time I was in the fifth grade, I had a teacher who really kind of encouraged that. And she had she let us write stories and read them in front of the class. And so I got to where I'd write these basically slasher fanfic stories in school, where all the kids in class were, being killed by my killer. And everybody loved it. I'm not sure if I would necessarily get away with that now, but man, it was a hit when I was a kid.
That's what I was thinking. Holy shit, that's cool. I feel like Candace has something to jump into, but real quick, for those that are just listening, I'm holding a Louis L'Amour Wild West. It just breaks down how he did the research. It's an illustrated celebration of America's favorite writer of Western. And I didn't know this, but it says he sold over 320 million copies of his books.
I don't know how many he had, but I mean,
That's a lot.
There's got to be like north of 100, right? I mean, if you go to the used bookstore,
It's
there's
over
so many
100.
of them, and I just
He's got his own bay.
Do what?
I said he's got his own bay at the used bookstore.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. And I love him. I mean, he's a really excellent writer.
Absolutely. Candace, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So, wow. you had a start a lot like mine, which is nice to hear, sort of a mixed bag of just everything you could get your hands on.
Mhm.
Um, the the novel, the Charlie Fish, it was almost like a perfect blend of like Western in sort of like sci-fi. Swamp Thing meets the Wild West almost. Where, where, where or how did you come up with the idea of that particular person persona within this Wild West story? I guess is my first question.
Yeah,
Why
well,
mix those two?
well, so um I've always written just kind of a mix of everything. I really don't often pay attention to what genre it is until I finish it. So I've written a bunch of fantasy and sci-fi and dark fantasy and horror and everything else. And my heart kind of lies with horror more than anything, I think, but I mix all those in there. And over the last few years, I have been writing a series of short stories. I've largely been a short story writer before this. I mean, I've written a ton of them and I love them. But I'd been writing a series of stories that were basically what I thought of as monster stories set
Mhm.
in Texas between like 1830 and 1930. So I think of them like as my old Texas stories. And I've
Yeah.
published a few here, and but everyone has some sort of you know monster in it essentially. And um, my family and I go to Galveston quite a bit for vacation, and I got to thinking how could I maybe use the famous Galveston hurricane in a book. And as I was thinking about monsters, I thought about the Universal monsters, which I loved, and I thought, well, obviously we need Creature from the Black Lagoon to stock up out of the water and kill everybody during this hurricane. And as I started putting the idea together, I realized, oh, okay, so my monster isn't really a bad guy. He's just kind of chill and likes to hang out and do his thing. So it really changed from what I originally wanted it to be. But yeah, it's really just kind of a part of a bigger series of stories that I've been working on.
Yeah, I loved it. I I actually liked how he was written. Like, I don't think how I want to word this. I like that he wasn't your traditional monster type of cre creature, but I
Yeah,
liked the whole sort of supernatural element between him and the child with the whole mental communication that they had and everything. I thought that was a nice twist to where they weren't one and the same, but they could communicate a lot. And I
yeah.
liked how it was more of a feel good type of story with the whole Wild West action and the impact and like a traditional Wild West story of, hey, we felt like you robbed us and we're gonna come after you and take back what's ours and hunt you down. And it had all that action from the Wild West. But at its heart, though, it was just this really feel good type of story. And I feel like he just wanted to go home. And it was just, and then all wrapped in with the horror of the hurricane itself, which was amazing when you add in all the action of that and then the tension. My next question actually was going to be if you lived there or lived near there for all the research and everything that you did with that, because I've read the afterward part of that as well and how you explain like the impact of that. So I liked how you wrapped that in there too. Do some of the other short stories that you have, do they include like realistic events like that one, or was that the first one that you like used? That was an actual like real event.
Yeah, that's the first one that's set during a particular historic event. I don't live in Galveston, but I've been there many times.
Yeah.
I've always lived in Texas, so I set a lot of my stories there. But Galveston really is just a place that we enjoy visiting, and if you're there enough, you start to pick up a lot of the history of that storm. And there's a really excellent book for anyone interested in that called Isaac Storm by Eric
Okay.
Larson. It's kind of a narrative history of that whole event, and it's really harrowing. And when I started talking to people about this book, I realized that it's something that everybody, most people in Texas know about this, but a lot of other people I talked to weren't aware of this hurricane, and it was such a devastating storm when it happened in 1900. It killed thousands and thousands of people, and it's just it's a great kind of place to set a climax for a novel like that. Really,
Yeah.
there are definitely others that have done that. One of them that's really good is The Big Blow by Joe
Mhm.
R. Lansdale. I read that in like 99 or 2000 when it came out. And so when I went back and wrote this, I intentionally kind of didn't reread that, so I didn't have it fresh in my head. But then
Mhm.
I did finish it. I went back and immediately reread it to make sure that I didn't just kind of pull stuff whole cloth from it for my memory. But that's a really excellent book too.
Okay. Patrick or
Yeah.
Brennan, when you guys want to step in?
Well, I got a little side path to go down with Galveston. There is my wife and I are big into the closest thing to horror that she'll like actively say, "Hey, let's watch this," is true crime, and we saw one called "Crime Scene: The Texas Killing Fields," and I think it's in Galveston.
It
Oh yeah, it
is.
is.
I
Yeah,
know
between
exactly the
Houston
one
and
you're talking
Galveston.
about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't know much about Texas before I got heavily into like Joe Lansdale. I, I'll
You'll
admit,
learn fast if you're reading Joe.
I admit my ignorance was what led to a lot of surprise. I was like thinking it was all, Wild West territory, when in reality, Wild West is many geographical locations. And Galveston, it kind of feels like it could be in the South Shore area of New Jersey. I mean the shore area, and kind of feels like that. It's really creepy stuff. And then reading this book, I didn't know about that hurricane. Never heard about it. So it's really neat. How different worlds collide. And I know obviously Joe Lansdale plays in that area. And the best blurb, man, is Joe's. He says, "Odd, creepy, funny. The Black Lagoon meets the Six Gun Universe. You need this." He's not a man that minces words. I gotta ask, how's it feel to have a cover blurb from Joe himself?
Astonishing, because let's say that I'm a super fan. I wouldn't quite call myself a stalker, but I'm a pretty crazy Joe Lansdale fan. When uh, I I grew up in a small town in West Texas, and I didn't discover his stuff when I was a teenager. But when I moved to Dallas in the early '90s, is when I first discovered Joe Lansdale on the shelf, and I read some of his stories and various anthologies I found, and they always stuck out to me as one, hey, this guy's from Texas, he's writing about Texas people, and I kind of know these people, and holy shit, this guy writes really weird stuff. Can you actually do this? I remember, the one that, and probably still my favorite story of his, is By Bizarre Hands.
I haven't
And I
read
read
that one.
that in it's
That
like
short story
Flannery
or
O'Connor on crack, basically. I mean, it's insane. It's in it's in the collection By Bizarre Hands, but
okay.
yeah, it's really strange, and I discovered it in one of the Borderlands anthologies, and I immediately started trying to figure out where I could find more of his stuff, and then I moved to Austin in the mid '90s, and there used to be a really cool bookstore called Adventures in Crime and Space, and Willie down there had basically anything Joe had written up to that point. And so I kind
Wow.
of started obsessively collecting all this stuff, and I am pretty sure I've read everything that he's published under his name. So when I met him probably, I don't know, first time maybe 15, 20 years ago, because he always comes to Armadillo Con, which
Yeah, yeah.
is the big con in Austin. And I will tell you that I was so starstruck. It took me like 5 years before I could walk up and actually talk to him. And it's ridiculous now that I know him, because he's like the most approachable, nice, friendly, helpful guy. And but man, I usually don't get kind of that way, but it took me a little bit to work up to it. But yeah, man, I'm just a super fan and really appreciative of that blurb.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Don't blame you for that.
I remember
Brennan,
thinking when he was reading, I was like, "Oh my gosh, Joe Lansdale is reading my book." Just like I would walk around thinking, "Oh gosh, what?"
I know there's way too many variables involved, but it's just I still don't understand how he's not as well known in the general public as Stephen King is. I would say he's just as prolific. He puts out
He's
so
amazing.
much shit.
And there's something for everybody. I mean, I that's he really has been kind of a guidepost on write whatever you want to write. I mean,
Yeah.
I used to kind of always think, okay, is this going to be, am I writing this or am I writing that? And it really doesn't matter. Just mix and match all those genres, and whatever feels good to you, it's going to work for somebody else. And yeah, I mean, whatever you like, Joe writes it. I mean, it's straight Western, straight horror, science fiction, crime, general weirdness, it's all there.
Yeah. I'll say one more thing about him. Because of him, like I give a lot of, whether I agree with stuff or not, if it strikes a certain chord, I let it digest. I'm slower with thinking and all that shit, I guess. But I let it digest for a little bit, and Joe's a lot of things he says really sticks with me. But one thing in particular that I use myself is, and I'm not knocking the opposing side of it, but he says I'm not uh insert whatever writer. I'm just a writer that writes this and that, and I like that. That works for me too. He's the first one I heard say that. I think it's smart. Don't pigeonhole yourself. But again, if it's not for you, it's not for you. Just like any advice. Brennan,
Yeah, I think if you sit there and you start, if as a writer, you start thinking, okay, well, in the writing process, right, you start going, where am I going to market this thing, or who's going to buy this? Then, you start to do the whole thing a disservice. Let it take those weird turns that the story wants to take, and
yeah,
figure out, who can give it a home afterwards. Just don't, let the weirdness go, right?
Yeah.
absolutely.
And I think you're dead on there because if you're thinking, forget pigeonholing yourself as a horror writer or a Western writer. If you approach it as I'm writing a horror book, then you might get to a turn where you say, well, a horror book wouldn't do this. This is not what horror fans want to read, or a Western book wouldn't go down this avenue, introduce this, monster. That's not what Western fans want to read. And truth be told, this book reminds me of kind of that same Lansdalean idea of it's not necessarily genre blending or genre transcendence, it's genre indifference, and I mean that in the most positive
That's
possible
a
way.
great term.
Yeah, and but that's what exactly what this is. Now, having said that, I got big thicket vibes early on, like come Floyd's first chapter. And then of course we get, the creature from the Black Lagoon, like we're full on Universal monster. But one kind of vibe I picked up, I don't even want to say genre, is certainly fantasy, but even more than that, almost kind of a fairy tale feel. And I wonder if that was something that
Ooh.
was intentional.
I don't know if it was intentional, but it's definitely part of like my writing DNA.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of that. If that sort of feel starts to creep in, I'm definitely gonna let it. I have set out. I mentioned that I write short stories primarily, and I've definitely set out to write fairy tale retellings and that type of thing, which I love. And so there are times when I've consciously done that. I didn't consciously do that here, but I tried to use language at least that feels very much kind of out of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'll tell you exactly what I was trying to go with out of the gate is True Grit. It's one of my favorite
That
books.
okay. That makes sense. I'm sorry to cut you off, but when
No,
you
no,
start
go
talking
ahead.
about the children and just tracking them down and protecting them from the bad guys. That makes sense. That popped in
It's
my
one of
head,
my
but I
favorite
wasn't
books,
sure.
and it's a wonderfully written book from the first person viewpoint of um, basically a 12-year-old, I think she's 12 at the start of the book, 12-year-old girl told from the perspective of her older self, basically recalling these events that happened when she was a girl. And the it just flows like a boat on a smooth river. I mean, you just go from word one and it just kind of carries you through there. And you know, I definitely had that in mind when I started it, but um, when I finished it, I realized, you know, how much the one of the protagonists of my book, Nellie, owes to Maddie Ross from True Grit. I mean, they're both very headstrong and kind of, you know, we're going to take charge of this situation, and you guys just kind of chill out over here, and we're going to get this done. And you know, I definitely, you know, went for that feel with it. And the best thing about True Grit is the dialogue. And I tried my best to kind of get something sort of similar to that as well. And it's not how anybody would really talk at all. It's and that's typically what you go for with writing anyway, right? Is you don't want to write necessarily exactly how people talk. You don't want all the ums and the ahs. But what I was going for here really is kind of super stylized dialogue with it. Um, you know, not to the point of say like Deadwood, but you know, nobody talks like they talk in Deadwood, but it's still really kick ass when they talk like that in the show, right? So I
Yeah.
was trying to go for something that you know, kind of along those lines, and it's really fun to write dialogue like that.
Well, you wrote you created the world, right? And it's got to have a certain. It's not. It's historical fiction with a supernatural, fantastical bend. So you're not gonna be writing like we're talking now, like you said. And
Yeah.
I think that's a good point because when I started writing, there's a few things I remember. That was like 11 years ago where I go, well, what the fuck do I start with? And then dialogue, reading it, it's really hard to figure it out at first. And I remember I tried doing the realistic approach, and that kind of trips you up sometimes.
Yeah, and I think dialogue's my favorite thing to write. Like, just it's um, when you really get it flowing kind of between two characters, it's a lot of fun, and I'll use it a lot of times to figure out kind of where my story's going. Like, there, you know, you're developing story, and I think the best way to do it is just let the characters kind of drive the car. And you know, you'll kind of get to the point where you're like, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I really want to take this person and have them interact with this person because they're going to have conflict. And you know, doing that through dialogue, you know, it always sparks a lot of ideas for me and a lot of, you know, directions to take stuff.
What
Yeah.
came first, the surname or the character with Charlie Fish? Like, did you think of his last name? And I know it's what the kids created, but did you come up with that nickname and then go, well, it should be, you know?
I literally just it was riding through there and they called him Charlie Fish. And I mean, I was just like, that's like the most 9-year-old little boy thing that he could come up with, right? Like he's literally a fish. And I've had some people come to me and go, hey, I read your book. He's literally a fish, Josh. I'm like, yeah. They're like, it's like a dude named Charlie Fish. I'm like, no, he's a fish. So yeah, it's just I can just see them going, what are we gonna call this guy? You know, we can't understand his fish language. Well, you know, we had a cat named Charlie and he's a fish. What else, you know?
That's excellent. I don't know about you, but the name Albert Fish jumped to mind because that's the only other person with that last name that I know.
Oh,
Um,
Charlie Fish is much kinder than Albert Fish.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
Charlie
fair.
actually can hang out with kids and not eat them. Candace.
Yeah,
Well, that's the sequel. You got to save something, right?
Oh,
yeah, you do.
the next one's Albert Fish.
So,
The Legend of Albert Fish coming
Yeah.
2024.
Brandon, did you have one? I don't want to.
Yeah, no, I'll throw one out. I was actually kind of curious whether or not you employed them in this book, besides dialogue, which, by the way, is my also my favorite element of, writing a Western. What are some of your favorite elements of Westerns?
Oh gosh. Man, I just I love everything about them, but I don't want when I'm writing them, I don't want them to be you know super traditional. I want to take those kind of elements and turn them on their head.
Mm.
I don't want everyone to be, hey, this, the guy came in to town and faces off with the sheriff, and there's so many I guess there's a perception of what people think of when they think of westerns, and I want to try and turn that on their head. I mean, all the best westerns do that. That isn't to say that I don't like, you know, early Hollywood westerns and all those. I mean, they're a ton of fun. But my favorite book of all time is Lonesome Dove, and it's just an absolute masterpiece. And it essentially takes the West and the romanticized version of the West, and it begins to kind of take it apart, right? Like it, you if you look at kind of our what we see as like our vision of the West, it all came really from Wild West shows. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, that what we think of as the Wild West was already gone and fading, but there was still kind of a thirst for it, particularly with people who hadn't experienced it. And so, Buffalo Bill's show and all these other shows toured the country, basically, putting on dioramas and plays and orations, telling what they wanted the story to be of the Old West. And it was their one version of what they want it to be, but it wasn't really what the Old West was. And so, all that kind of filtered into the movies and even still into what we think about what the Old West is. But I really like books and movies that kind of turn that on its head and give us different perspectives from different people, and gives us something a little bit more realistic of what it was like. I guess more historical fiction than Wild West, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and I think, just off topic a little bit, I think Lansdale's Paradise Sky is a really, really great example of just exactly
Yes.
that. But more to the
It's
point,
his best novel, I think. Like
I think
I
so
think it's
too,
my
and
favorite Lansdale novel of them all.
I believe he thinks so too, if I remember reading that right.
It's absolutely tremendous. It's one of the best westerns written in the last 30 years for sure.
But that idea of, the difference between the kind of romanticization of the West, and what we wanted it to be. I love the way that you addressed that, and you wrote about this in the afterword. But I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about it, uh, about that kind of balance around the year 1900 of we're about to hit this kind of like leap forward in society that's really going to separate, at least the time period that we think of as the Wild West, if not the, reality of it, from modern times. Yeah, I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit more about how you work that into this novel.
Yeah, it's always fascinated me. That turn of the century time period. We sort of have a vision in our head of what the 1800s were versus what the 1900s were. As my kids love to say, "Oh, you were born back in the 1900s, Dad." So, but there's that period, and the Legend of Charlie Fish takes place literally in 1900, so the characters kind of have cause to comment on it. But that's that period where we're really about to accelerate as a society, right? Like at that point, you have automobiles beginning to appear, and but most folks are still taking wagons and riding horses. You have electricity, obviously, but it's not far and wide. But within not that many years, it'll be everywhere. You are, you know, 20 years away, less than 20 years away from airplanes. And you literally have people riding around on horses. It's just such a massive tipping point in time. And the people who are living in it, it's interesting to see how they would navigate that. I mean, it it's akin to those of us who existed before and after the internet, right? It's just a complete change in how you live your life, from this 5 years to the next 5 years. And so a lot of what I've been writing lately does kind of center in that 1900, 1905 kind of area. And it's just fascinating to me. I mean, I can't imagine, being someone who, their whole life they've gone to an outhouse and used candles and ridden horses. And, all of a sudden they're in their 40s or something and they're flying in an airplane, across the country. And it's astonishing. And it started moving so rapidly at that point. You're riding in a wagon and, less than 70 years later, you're on the moon.
Yeah, it's a weird time, man. And just think about it. Like I don't know the time. I don't know exactly when, all these utility poles went up, but you also got, we're talking about you're talking about the 30s, right? 20s, 30s.
In this, I'm talking about basically 1900, and there,
Okay.
like Galveston, because Galveston had electricity, but obviously not every place had electricity. They literally strung electric lights along the beach, from poles, and some of the businesses and houses had electricity, but most of them were still using lanterns and things.
Yeah, and like a half century later, you got highways. So it's very strange, man. Really weird time, I'm sure. But like you were saying with the internet, I'm the youngest one here, and I I remember what it was like before, in all aspects, and it's it's bizarre. It's really weird. Like I had a
Yeah,
cell
it's
phone
learning to live
freshman year,
your
and
life a different way, right?
it's very weird. But I'm glad we got this because I don't know who I'd be talking to right now. I think there won't be podcasts, I guess. So yeah, I'm really
We'd
glad
be
that we
writing
got
back and
this.
forth, right? We'd be sending letters back to each other.
Uh,
My career as a short story writer definitely goes back to the days of self-addressed stamped envelopes. So you would mail your short story to Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and send a envelope along with the stamp on it so they could send you your rejection back in the mail. So
That actually leads right into what I wanted to ask you about next. So thank you for doing half my job.
happy.
Um, so we've talked about the story, the character, where it came from, a lot of the research, the time frame. So let's talk a little bit about you personally and your experiences as a writer. So two-part question here, I suppose. So one, can you talk a little bit about how your experiences throughout your journey has changed? Like you just said, how you had to send the self-addressed stamped envelopes and everything and wait for months until what we have now. And how has the industry, the community and the environment itself changed from when you started to where you are now? Whether it was in a positive way, negative way, a mix of both.
I think it's all positive. I started, like I said, I started writing when I was a kid. I started submitting uh, about the year 2000. So I wrote a whole lot of crap before I got confident enough to start sending my stuff out. And I think I've published about 70 stories since then. So I definitely started out submitting to magazines and some of the earliest webzines like Strange Horizons, which is still around, and at that time sci fiction. Ellen Datlow edited sci fiction, which was an online science fiction fantasy magazine hosted by the Sci-Fi Channel. And so I never broke into that market, but I was super persistent with it. But I always kind of wrote all over the place. So I published in horror mags, I published in fantasy mags, and it's just something I've really enjoyed. What's different now is it seems like it's a lot easier to find your writing buddies and your writing community. At that time, we were using message boards. So there was one called Speculations that a lot of people hung out on. There was the the Shock Lines message board was big back in the day, and so that's where I met a lot of the folks that I still, know and hang out with today. It's just a little bit easier now, I think, with social media being so pervasive to kind of find those people than it used to be. Obviously, there's a whole lot of negativity that comes with social media too. And having said all that, I would say if I wasn't a writer, I would immediately get off every social media platform and never log in again. But it's important to be able to stay connected with the writing community because we all love that support, that commiseration. Hey, this is what it is to be a writer and a reader, and just the benefits of being able to meet people who like the same things you do and write the same things you do. I think ultimately for me, it outweighs kind of the bad side of just some of the ridiculousness that occurs on social media. But I'm really kind of still doing the same thing that I always did story wise. I mean, I'm rarely invited into closed anthologies or anything, so I'm writing stories on spec and I'm submitting it to the top magazines. I usually start with the one that kind of what would be my dream market on a certain story, and then I work my way down until I find the best home for it, and thankfully I've been fairly successful with it. Novel writing, I joke and say I accidentally wrote Charlie Fish, because but I've written 6 or 8 novels that never sold. That's just kind of part of the process, I think. But I spent so much time writing those, I kind of strayed from short stories, and so I eventually decided that short stories were something that I really loved. They weren't just a means to an end to kind of get to the point where I could publish a novel. So I think I'll always keep doing those. But I sat down one day and I thought, okay, so novellas are kind of cool. I don't let me try and maybe write a novella instead of devoting all this time to another novel. And it throughout the process just sort of grew to the point where it kind of squeaked up to the word count of a novel. And so depending on who you ask, it's either a very short novel or a very long novella. Again, that's one of those things that I'll just let marketers figure out what they want to call it.
Okay. So along those same lines, why do you write? Like, what makes you want to write? Do you write to entertain? Did you just want to tell stories? Is there something more than that? It's just who you are. Like, what fuels you to continue year after year after year, story after story? Like, why is it that you write?
I just absolutely love it. I mean, I feel like I'm driven to write. I've written stories literally since I learned to write. I mean, I have, I talked about my 5th grade stories, but I had written, I'd written well before that. So there's never been a time in my life that I wasn't writing, to the point where if I go long enough without writing, I get really anxious about it. I get kind of irritable, and I feel like I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, right? And I'm not one of those people who writes every day. I've just never been able to set the schedule, and that works great for some people. It doesn't for others. I think you have to kind of find what fits your reality best. But I write a lot. I definitely write something every week, usually several days a week. But if I get in those situations where life gets away from me and I've got too much going on and I look up and I haven't written anything in a couple weeks, I realize, oh, that's why I'm super angsty all the time. And I can kind of sit down and start working on that. And I just sort of feel everything kind of even out in my brain a little bit. I just, but yeah, the short answer is I just absolutely love it. And, I would write, even if I wasn't able to get it published.
I can relate to that. Where if I don't write for a while, I get all, twitchy in my head.
That's the only way I can describe it, is like I get really like twitchy and angsty, and I know that's what's causing it. Like I'm walking around and I have, when you're really kind of sparking on something, you'll find yourself kind of walking around, just sort of staring into the distance and not really paying attention to what's going on in your life, and you'll have to sort of catch up and go, oh wait, what was I? And so all that stuff is percolating in your head, and that's an important part of the writing process. But if I let that go on too long, it just kind of starts to build, and I'm like, you need to get in there. And even if I sit down and start making notes, it's part of the process. But if I don't do it, it my brain gets itchy.
I get it. We got a question from Chris Panay. I might be messing up his last name. Panettiere.
And a tear.
I think so. He said, I finished The Legend of Charlie Fish. I loved it. There's a particular character death that broke me. That was probably right for the story. I won't spoil who it is. Josh knows, but I'm curious if he struggled with the decision to kill them off.
Hey, Chris, who's an awesome writer, by the way.
Nice.
I really didn't.
You monster.
I kind of knew that was going to happen from jump. I will tell you that if it wasn't for my editor at Tachyon, there would have been others. So we kind of, when I first submitted the story to Tachyon, it was actually quite a bit shorter. It was a true novella. I think the final version of Charlie Fish is about maybe 52,000 words. When I first submitted it was 25,000 words. And I got feedback from several folks at Tachyon, including my editor, Rick Claw, about how to kind of what they would like to see to improve the story. And what it resulted in is an entirely second point of view. If you read the book, it's alternating first person point of view. So there are two characters, Floyd and Nellie, and you go back and forth between their points of view. The original story only had Floyd's parts of the book. If you look at it still, you can get the entire plot from that section, but I think a lot of the really cool stuff comes from Nellie's section, where you can really get into her head, particularly since she has what she calls her whisper talk, which sort of is her ability to kind of get into people's minds. And so you really get kind of an idea of what people are thinking. So, I owe it to the folks at Tachyon for kind of helping bring that out and making this a stronger book. But Chris, they also had me do a little retooling on the ending because I was going to be a little bit more brutal than I actually was in the book itself.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Plus you pretty much you doubled up on your word count, which that shows you how much they believed in your initial story, man.
Yeah, and I think it was good, but I mean it's dramatically better. Nellie's by far my favorite character in the book. The whole thing she was obviously already a main character, but you weren't getting it from her point of view. And when those parts came together, it really fleshed it out for me, and it made me understand the story a lot better when I put that. Like, all of a sudden you've got these character arcs where they're all orphans and they're kind of all hunting for the same thing, and you kind of got some additional backstory on some of the other characters, and it Yeah, it just really made it a lot better.
Yeah, I really like the whisper talk. Brennan or Candace, do you have anything before we start wrapping up?
I guess I would just throw in that when you say that when you say that you knew that character was not going to make it, it sounds cold hearted, but I think most writers have been there where it doesn't mean that you're a heartless son of a bitch. It just means that this is the way the story has to go. And
Yeah.
man, I don't like it, but I've come to terms with just this is how it's got to be.
Yeah, I'm not saying I was like, cheering for anybody's, downfall in the book, but it was one of those where you know, you can't have a perfectly happy ending in this thing, right? Like I felt like that would be a cheat, because the book is a little bit more lighthearted than most of what I write, but I would say at the very least it's pretty melancholy. And I think that contributed that quite a bit. Most of what I write is quite a bit more grim than Charlie Fish, but that just felt like the right tone for this one. But yeah, I couldn't let everybody escape unscathed.
Certainly not. All right, now before we go to wrap, your newest collection, Fantastic Americana,
Hmm.
I wonder if you could just kind of give us a little elevator pitch for it. If people are looking to check out a bunch of your short fiction in one place, what can they expect in this collection?
Yeah, that collection is all over the place. Basically, I had a short fiction collection come out about 15 years ago that was mostly at that time unpublished stuff, but I'd never really collected a lot of my favorite stories from magazines and anthologies over the years. And so Fantastic Americana does that. It's a mix of horror, dark fantasy, sci-fi, alternate history, weird ass shit. I mean, it's just it runs the gamut. It's really all over. If you like Charlie Fish, I mentioned that I have a few other stories that are in that world. I don't have anything that crosses over with characters from Charlie Fish, but these stories kind of exist in the same place in my mind. So I have a couple of them in there. One of them is called The Guadalupe Witch, and one of them is called February Moon. And they're two of my favorite stories, and they both kind of take place in that same alternate version of Texas that Charlie Fish does. There's straight up horror stories in there. There's Chasing America, which I published many years ago, which is basically Paul Bunyan on the run from giant killers named Jack throughout American history. So just kind of really kind of some weird stuff. But yeah, it's a Fantastic Americana. It came out from Fairwood Press.
That's awesome. I did want to ask, how's it been like working with another Lansdale, Casey?
Oh my gosh, Casey's awesome.
Yeah.
Uh, so Casey's the publicist for Tachyon, who was assigned to my book. And if I could have made time for 100 bookstore appearances, Casey would have set up 100 bookstore appearances. Like it was really amazing. I email her today that I think this is my last promotional thing for Charlie Fish, and I'm just grateful that she was so engaged with it. I did being a short story writer. Those of us who write short stories love them, but they those kinds of things don't always take off like a novel will. I mean, novels are just more popular, and so this was really the first opportunity I had after like 20 years of writing to go do bookstore signings and go do podcast interviews and things like that. So
Nice.
it's just been a blast, and Casey set all that up, and couldn't be more thankful.
Yeah, she's absolutely wonderful. All right. So where can people follow you?
I'm on all the awful hated social media sites that you can name. I probably am more engaged on Twitter than anywhere else, for better or worse, just because I'm connected with more folks there. It's Josh _ Rountree, and there is no D in Rountree, so ROUNTREE. But I'm on Instagram and whatever all the other ones are. I've at least got a presence there, but I think Twitter's where I hang out the most.
Right on. Candace.
You can find me at uncomfortablydark.com as well as all the social media platforms under either my name or under Uncomfortably Dark.
Brennan.
You can follow me on sidewalks, dark alleys, or Twitter.
There it is.
Yeah.
One and the same, isn't that right? Like,
One of them is horrifying.
it's not the dark alley.
You can follow the show at Dead Headspace. Any of the big ones, social media. You can follow me at PR McDonough. Unless I'm not on that platform. Blech, can't talk. Final thoughts, Josh.
Thank you all for letting me be on the show.
Absolutely.
I really love the opportunity. I would tell people, go read short stories. They're awesome. They're still my favorite thing. I'm gonna keep writing them.
Yeah, they are great. Candace.
Thank you for your time on the show tonight. Thank you for writing The Legend of Charlie Fish because I thought it was fantastic.
Thank you.
I like when things don't go the normal route sometimes. It's a nice twist and it's like you don't see it coming. You're thinking, oh, it's gonna be a weird Western, and then it's so much more. So yeah, it was great. So hopefully we can see you again next year and see what you have then.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to see if I can do it again.
I'm sure you will.
Brennan.
I'm gonna echo Candace and thank you for your time. I absolutely loved my time in turn of the century Galveston. This was, like I said, a really, really cool novel. And if people have not checked it out yet, I hope that they will, just because of that unexpected, we're going to bring back the term genre indifference, and the fact that it just makes the avenues that a story can go unlimited. I would also like to throw out that your initial what got you into writing, what got you into reading, you threw out Encyclopedia Brown, and that did not go unnoticed. Big shout
Nobody
out
knows
to
Encyclopedia Brown anymore.
Oh, I know Encyclopedia Brown. Yeah.
I'll just say that it's a fun novel. I'm wondering what it would have been like if you were just completely untethered with all those murders. But check out The Legend of Charlie Fish. We're gonna do a giveaway that goes along with this episode. Josh was kind enough to sign a copy, send it my way for one of you lucky listeners. I just want to thank you for your time. It was really neat finding out a few more things behind the scenes of this book. Um, like I said, it kind of expanded this small town in Texas that I randomly keep finding media material on, and it was interesting. I hope you do explore this universe again because, like I said, it's fun, and you could probably get away with a lot of different things in here. Like I did pick up on how you dropped like dime novels, for example, and I'm like, I appreciate little details like that. Like you don't have to notice them, but you can, and that's why I like well written historical fiction. And I think you did a good job. That's probably why Joe loved it.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm definitely, seeding little things in there and planting other stuff in this world. So hopefully that'll see the light of day.
Absolutely. Next episode is with Christopher Ruffty. That's going to be real fun. He's got a hell of a lot of different. I did read that very dark book, Candace, and oh my God. We'll talk about that next week. Everybody have many choices in podcasts. Thank you for picking us.